Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new TEAM therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 63 of the Feeling Good podcast. We are continuing on our Ask David series now, trying to go through the pipeline of questions we've been getting from our listeners. And last time we had answered a question from Avi, and we have another message here from Avi that sort of touches on a similar subject, but not quite. So Avi says, I would like to elaborate a bit on my previous post. I'm assuming that your answer might take the general form of finding the sublime quality and the deep virtue of their resistance. But in the case of hopelessness, it seems hard to make a convincing case of something phenomenal in the person giving up, something that will truly resonate with the struggling person and stir within them the awakening of resilience and coping. Further, in the case of habits and addictions, the suggested rationale for resistance was simply that the addiction is easy and pleasurable, and conquering it is difficult and very demanding. Where here can we find something beautiful and powerful in the addict's attachment to their addiction? Great question.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll tackle the hopelessness first, and thank you, Avi, for your thoughtful questions. One of the techniques, as you probably know by now, Avi, that I use in treating people with depression and anxiety is called positive reframing. And this is part of the paradoxical agenda setting to help them see that what we think of as resistance to change or their symptoms, their negative thoughts, their negative feelings, are actually reflections of what is most beautiful and awesome about the patient. And that in addition, the negative thoughts and feelings sometimes have tremendous benefits and advantages for the patient. And I'll have to admit that initially when I was doing this, it took me a while to learn how to do the positive reframing, and it's been a joy to be able to get stronger and stronger at it, to see how more and more things that look terribly negative to us are actually in some ways very positive for the patient. Now, Beck has told us that hopelessness is the worst emotion of all, and that's why many people commit suicide. He said that we can put up with any physical or emotional pain as long as we see it's time limited.
Yeah.
But when depressed people get hopeless, they tell themselves,
this will never end.
It will never end. I'm a loser, and my pain will go on forever. And then they turn to suicide as an escape, and that's all very, very true. So because of that, I was just trained to think of hopelessness as like about the worst thing in the world. But then when I got to working with positive reframing, I suddenly realized that there are at least two or three overwhelmingly good things about hopelessness. One thing is that when the patient says, I'm hopeless, it shows that they're being very realistic, that they're describing the facts of their life in a courageous way, the facts as they understand them. When I was in practice in Philadelphia, the average patient who came to me and to our clinic had 12 to 15 failed courses of treatment before coming to the clinic, and that included many types of psychotherapy, and that included antidepressant drugs as well. And so when the patient says, I'm hopeless, they're really showing themselves to be honest and accountable and saying that this is the truth as I understand it, rather than denying it and going into some kind of Pollyanna point of view. A second thing about hopelessness is that it protects you from disappointment. I can remember, feeling good, I treated a young woman whose brother had committed suicide, a physician, and she blamed herself for his death because he had contacted her the day he killed himself and asked a question, and it didn't dawn on her that he was asking how to kill himself, and so she was suicidal. And I had a tremendous course of therapy with her. It took about 7 or 8 sessions, and she recovered from the depression, and then was able to grieve the loss of her brother. And so she was excited and referred a colleague to me, a woman who was pregnant and was an expert in, let's say, neonatal issues.
Sure.
And was heavily addicted to alcohol and drugs, and also very, very, very severely depressed. And what made it particularly bad for her was she was pregnant and knew very well that all the pills that she was taking and the alcohol,
of all people, she knew exactly what was going on.
Yeah, and that this could cause a birth defect. And at the very first session, I was talking to her, and she kind of lashed out at me and said, I've been to, I've read every, and she was very overweight too, which was also a problem. And she says, I've read every book there is on weight loss and getting over alcoholism and drug abuse, and I've tried every program out there, and I have failed. Nothing works for me. And then she looked at me and angrily and said, "What are you going to do that's so different?" And I really, felt on the defensive, like I was being attacked. And it was the first time I had met her, and I had reached out to help her, and she kind of bit my hand.
Right.
And she was feeling very, very, very hopeless and very angry. But when you think about it, and this dawned on me, and then I was able to use this to form a connection with her, that her hopelessness is actually protecting her from disappointment. You see, she's tried all of these things that didn't work, and so if she gets her hopes up and trusts David, who's been highly recommended by her friend, and then it doesn't work, she'll just be crushed even
once more. Yeah.
So that's a huge thing there, that the hopelessness protects you from further pain. And then a third thing about it, I would say that the hopelessness reveals an intelligence about the patient, kind of a high IQ type of thing. They don't have to have a high IQ, but it is a very intelligent thing. When I went to Amherst College, it was all about critical thinking. Don't be gullible. Learn to see through things. Mm-hmm. And we spent 4 years of a liberal arts education to get really good at that.
Yeah.
But that's essentially what the depressed patient is saying. I don't believe in your snake oil. Mm-hmm. You see, I'm the one who can't get better. You're going to have to prove it to me.
Yeah.
So it shows a kind of healthy skepticism. So that's just one of the symptoms and of the hopelessness and how to reframe it. But then I'd also be reframing their depression, their shame, their guilt, all the other negative feelings as well.
One thing I want to point out is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for people who've listened to the live sessions you've done with your wonderful co-therapists, Jill and Matt, is when you go through the positive reframing, sometimes the client may not be able to find those positive things. Like, whoa, what? Just like what Avi's asking, I don't know what's positive about hopelessness. And you might say something, what I've heard you say, things like, well, wouldn't you say that you're being very realistic when you see this, and say, oh, yeah, and you'll go, well, isn't that a good thing?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
And then say, oh, yeah. And so we'll write it down.
Yeah.
So that seems to be like your way of getting it out of the client.
Oh, yeah. And we're thinking that a lot of the reason that the team therapy is so powerful is because what I used to view as just resistance busting techniques, like positive reframing, are actually antidepressant techniques. Yeah. So before you get to any of the methods, the person is already feeling better. And on this topic, I'll be quick on this, but it is interesting. Jill Levitt the clinical psychologist who I teach with at Stanford in my free Tuesday group for Bay Area mental health professionals.
And who also works at the Feeling Good Institute.
Right. We met with James Gross at Stanford in the Department of Psychology. Mm-hmm. They have a research psychology department, and he's a world-famous psychology researcher, and he's done a lot of brain imaging studies and things like this. But we had the delightful opportunity to present to him and all of his graduate students kind of this high-speed treatment that we've developed, and showed them a couple video before and after that was very dramatic, and to see if we could kick up some research collaboration with them, in particular to find out how team therapy works, why it seems to be so much faster than other forms of therapy. So they're going to develop a group of people from his department who are interested in this, and we're going to be meeting with them and see what we can come up with. And the idea would be for Jill and I to do some live therapy, and for them to do some kind of testing as the session goes on to see what are the effective ingredients and why and
that'd be
how does
wonderful.
it work.
That'd be wonderful.
Yeah. He was really a nice person too. Sometimes these world famous people, sometimes they're just narcissistic and horrible, but sometimes they're the opposite, humble and warm. And he was like that. And it was just, we felt so honored to have a chance to meet with him.
Good. And now, how about the addiction part?
Yeah. Well, just to give one quick example of that, and this is an echo of a previous podcast. Some of the listeners would remember the podcast about Benny, who I treated at my hospital in Philadelphia. He was a violent and suicidal individual who had
I remember Benny.
Yeah, severe depression, and he challenged me during a group that he was a hopeless case and there's nothing you can do about it. And so I used what's called a paradoxical cost-benefit analysis. Asked him, with the help of the group, it was a cognitive therapy treatment group, before I show you why that thought that you're a hopeless case is false, let's look at all the benefits to you. And at first he couldn't get it. Say, "Oh, doc, there ain't no benefits. I've dropped out of all the treatment programs, and I'm going to be dead in 2 years. You can count on it." I said, "No, Benny, you're not getting it. The feeling like you're a hopeless case is the greatest thing in the world for you. And what are some of the benefits?" And then, with the help of the group, we came up with a list of 17 benefits for him to tell himself he's hopeless, and one thing he can keep using drugs all the time, and he's a drug dealer, and he's got tremendous heroin and cocaine. Number two, it's easy. If he's hopeless, he doesn't have to do the work that the rest of the group are doing to identify cognitive distortions. Third, he has the reputation of beating people up. He had what's called intermittent explosive disorder, as well as severe depression and all the rest. And so people are afraid of him. And also he gets a lot of adulation. He's a big man in the community because he's a kind of a violent drug dealer. And he said that he gets laid all the time because he's a bad boy with a good-looking bad boy, and then just on and on. He doesn't have to be responsible. He makes the rules. He's kind of like James Dean. He drives his motorcycle, and he sells drugs, and he gets laid, and he beats people up, and on and on and on. And so we made this list of 17 benefits to him.
Yeah.
And saying I'm a hopeless case, and continuing to sell drugs and use drugs. And then at the end, I just said, "Benny, it sounds like you got a good thing going. Why in the world would you want to change this?" And then he said, "Doc, you read me like a book," and described watching his grandfather shoot himself with a shotgun in the mouth when Benny was about 6 or 7 years old. He'd never talked about it, and how devastating it was for him to witness this horrific event. He began to sob and really kind of opened up. But I had to be willing to see why Benny was stuck, why he'd failed out of all these treatment programs, because no one had looked at the benefits not only of his hopelessness, but also his addiction and his kind of wild antisocial ways. And the very moment I could see it through his eyes and was able to say, Benny, I don't see why you'd want help to change. You've got a good thing going. And I really saw it. And at that moment, he suddenly softened and changed and opened up. And it was a paradox.
So, interestingly, there's a difference here between how you address the hopelessness and the addiction. What you point out in the hopelessness are what you might call traits, positive traits in the person. In the addiction, is more like benefits, like advantages.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I couldn't agree more.
Let me go back to what Avi wrote about. Where can we find something beautiful and powerful in the addict's attachment to their addiction? I will underscore the word beautiful. What is beautiful about Benny's
well, I think you can even tease that piece out because he's kind of like James Dean. And what I told him, I said, Benny, you're the kind of man I always wanted to be. You beat the out of people, choose the language when you don't like them, and I've always wanted to do that, but I never could because I was a minister's son, and I have to be so darn nice to everyone. And I really did see him as a kind of excuse me, I got a little bronchitis, or a cultural icon. And he really liked that, and he also sensed that I liked him. So I wasn't playing a trick on him.
Yeah.
And I let him convince me that he really should not change, that there was no reason to change, that he had something great going, and he rides his motorcycle, he's free as the breeze. That is a kind of a beautiful thing. And that's a more primitive aspect of our life, and the rest of us, we have to conform to the rules of society. You see, there's something kind of heroic about what he's doing. Also, if when I work with people with, but it is mainly benefits. And when I work with people with, say, overeating, I do a double paradox. I say, list all the advantages of overeating and eating as much as you want whenever you want. And there's like 10 or 15 advantages. And now let's list the disadvantages of change. We'll have all this discipline and all this deprivation, and then say to the patient, can you convince me to work with you? Why in the world would you want to give this up?
Yeah.
And that's paradoxical agenda setting, and it's in my experience, it's incredibly powerful.
Well, I hope that addresses Avi's question. We have another one here from Eugene, who says, thank you for your work and taking the time to read my question. In Feeling Good, pages 334 through 341, there is an imagined conversation where you show that a person's worth and value, so we're back to that, isn't determined by their accomplishments or social standing. While I appreciate your position, I must say that I disagree with your ultimate conclusion that one cannot state outright what makes a person more or less valuable than any other. I believe your imagined interaction with the so-called persecutor stops just shy of its logical conclusion. And so my question is, what would you say to a patient who doesn't cry uncle, but persists to a point of establishing a framework of what does or doesn't make a life valuable?
Well, that's such a great question, and I'll be writing about that a lot. I've written about it a lot already in my new book that I'm working on. I'll just make two quick responses to that. Sometimes one can get confused by the difference between being a worthwhile human being and, say, being a worthwhile tennis player, a good tennis player, or a good therapist. And certainly, if you're putting together a tennis team, and if I know that you, Fabrice, are a 5.0 tennis player, which would be a super strong tennis player,
which doesn't describe me at all.
Me neither. I'm 2.5 or at best. But a really strong tennis player would be a more valuable member of my team. Does that mean that's also that person is a more worthwhile human being? You see, we can measure specific traits about ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors, and we can rate them as more or less worthwhile. Like we could have a podcast that's quite much more effective than some of our other podcasts, and we can have another one that's much less effective.
Yeah.
But that's all we can really comment on is the specific things that we're doing.
Yeah.
But it is not true that if you're an exceptionally good tennis player, you're a more worthwhile human being. And it's not true that if you have this or that fault or flaw, that makes you a less worthwhile human being. That's one way to answer that question. We could have a whole 2 or 3 podcasts just on this, but I'll leave it at that. But the second point that I want to make is I don't believe in helping people against their will. So that, let's say you have a value system that says my worth as a human being depends on my achievements, my worthwhileness as a human being. Now, that's not a belief that I endorse. I used to endorse it.
Yeah.
But I have given that up, and giving it up has brought so much joy in my life and eliminated so much stress and depression and anxiety and frustration. However, if a patient says, I want to base my self-esteem, my feelings of worthwhileness on my achievements, I would say let's do a cost-benefit analysis. How's it going to help you to believe that, and how's it going to hurt you to believe that? What are the benefits and what are the costs? And if the person decides it's to their advantage to believe that, I don't argue with them, but I simply sit with open hands and say, well, that's great. Is there anything else I could help you with?
Yeah. Yes, because I think that one of the point Eugene is making here is having a client that will argue, well, but look at me, I'm disabled. I don't know how to add 1 + 1. I'm not very altruistic. I can't hold a racquetball. I cannot do this. I cannot do that. What am I worth? And you may just say, well, gee, it sounds to me like you have a lot of good reasons to measure your worth that way. And let's see, what benefits you derive from that.
Yeah. You have to have a patient who wants to change, and the greatest therapeutic error of all, and I used to make it all the time, is to engage in these arguments, try to help someone or fix someone to my own value system, and that's the cause of almost all therapeutic failure.
Yeah. In fact, I wanted to give a preview of coming attractions. Since you're talking about sitting with open hands, we're planning to do an episode once we're done with the series on the 5 secrets on sitting with open hands, and also the gentle ultimatum. Those are very. Oh,
that's right. Yes, and
very difficult.
And another thought I had, I meant to mention to you, but when we do our 5 secrets, we can invite other people from my group, like Helen or Kyle Jones. And they can come and join us and do the role playing.
Yeah, that would be great.
We can make those really fun and exciting.
All right. Well, this concludes today's podcast. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Fabrice.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.